Hello, everybody. I would like to look with you at a point that Dr. Jan Olberg made on this channel a few months ago, and that's what he called the inherent criminality of NATO, or let's say the quite incredible way in which today's NATO is in breach of its own charter. This is a significant issue, and I believe it should be better understood. So, if we look at the North Atlantic Treaty, and this document should be read by a lot of people and should be studied in order to understand where a lot of big parts of the world actually have today a problem with NATO, especially when people argue that NATO is an organization that is purely here for self-defense, right, and would never ever harm innocent people, right? It's here to protect people. Let's look at the charter and then let's look at the realities of what NATO itself is saying of what it does today. So the North Atlantic Treaty is an old one, you know. It was created in 1949. That's when the big signing ceremony happened in Washington, D.C. And the most important articles in order to understand how what NATO was created to be are really here present in Article 1 through 7. So let's read those for a moment and then see how today's NATO lives up to that. Article 1 is actually framed in a way that it defines NATO as in compliance with the United Nations Charter, right? Article 1 reads, the parties undertake as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So NATO is actually not supposed to even threaten force against third states, right, in their international relations. And it's not just NATO as an organization, it is the member states themselves that bind themselves to the promise that they would live in accordance to UN Charter principles, which means the rejection of the use of force or the threat of the use of force. So Article 1 is actually a very peaceful, peacefully framed basic setup of NATO. Then Article 2 says that the parties will contribute toward the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions, by bringing about a better understanding of the principles upon which these institutions are founded, and by promoting conditions of stability and well-being. They will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between any or all of them. I could immediately sign up to Article 1 and Article 2 of the NATO Charter. These are principles that are framed so generally and are meant to encourage the peaceful interactions among not only NATO members, but NATO and NATO member states and outside forces, right? It's all about the development of peaceful international relations. Then come the more problematic ones, articles. So let's read Article 3. In order more effectively to achieve the objectives of this treaty, the parties separately and jointly, by means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid, will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attacks. It's quite interesting that this article is not framed as we will contribute 2% of GDP to our military forces. Not at all. It doesn't even talk about military forces. Article 3 just says that each member state will contribute to the capacity to resist armed attack, right? It doesn't even say that this capacity to resist has necessarily to be a military one. That's what 1949 was all about. And then you see, like, if you listen to current discussions about member states having to pay up and so on, how much militarized the current discourse actually is when compared to the early Cold War. Article 4 is a very important one. It's a one sentence that says the parties will consult together whenever, in the opinion of any of them, the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the parties is threatened. This article is the one that member states can call on when they want a meeting of the entire NATO collective in order to because they feel threatened because an attack happened or they perceive that an attack on them has happened and then they want to mobilize the whole of NATO. So if somebody talks about activating Article 4, that's what they mean, a meeting of all of them. And then, of course, the pivotal Article number 5, which is often misunderstood. Right, people talk about Article 5 as if though it was an automatic guarantee that all states would go to war with a potential aggressor. But read it in the original and you see that that's not the case. Let's read Article 5. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. The important thing here in this passage is that each party will take the actions that it deems necessary, including military actions, not necessarily military actions, right? Nothing in Article 5 says that member states have to automatically come to the military aid of an attacked party. It says they can do so if they choose to, but they don't necessarily have to, which is why the entire talk about Article 5 being an automatic security guarantee is actually nonsense. It's not according to not according to what's written in this charter here. It can be used as a justification of collective self-defense, but it's not a necessary part. The second paragraph then reads that any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the Security Council. Such measures shall be terminated when the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security. Again, the NATO Charter affirms that NATO is not a replacement of the UN. It's just meant as a club in addition to the UN, and that actually the Security Council is the one responsible to implement measures of when force has to be taken in the international realm. So the Security Council is the only body worldwide that has the international legal standing to mandate military action. NATO doesn't. NATO can only help collective self-defense of NATO members. That's all, and that's what the treaty here recognizes. And then one of the things that bothers me a lot is when NATO when NATO redefines itself and expands its own intervention scope by just redefining where it can go, because Article 6 actually states very clearly what the NATO area is, in which parts of the world NATO can be active and beyond which it mustn't go, because it is so clearly defined. So let's read again where NATO is supposed to act and to be active. For the purpose of Article 5, an armed attack on one or more of the parties is deemed to include an armed attack, 1, on the territory of any of the parties in Europe or North America, on the Algerian departments of France, which, by the way, is again one of these colonial leftovers, because in 49 Algeria was part of France, right? It's because France is this colonial state that from which Algeria had to fight a very bloody war in order to finally get rid of the French. But in 49, Algeria was explicitly included in the North Atlantic Charter. But then it continues on the territory of Turkey or on the islands under the jurisdiction of any of the parties in the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. What is the Tropic of Cancer? The Tropic of Cancer is this line here. It's the northernmost part of the world where the sun can still shine in a 90-degree angle, right? It's not the equator. This is not the equator. This is the far above the equator. So anything north of here in the Atlantic area, any possessions of the European powers, this is where NATO, the NATO alliance area actually is. So what this tells you is that the people who framed the North Atlantic Treaty Charter were quite aware that Europe still had significant possessions outside of this area. For instance, Britain having still being in the possession of the Falkland Islands in front of Argentina, right? And the Falkland Islands are explicitly not covered by the North Atlantic Treaty, or the possessions of France in the Caribbean, or the possessions of France in South America, right? All of these colonial remnants are officially not covered by the treaty organization. Only what's above this line in the around the North Atlantic are explicitly covered. That's what this treaty makes sure. Then the second point is that it's also valid on the forces, vessels, or aircrafts of any of the parties when in or over these territories or any other area in Europe in which occupation forces of any of the parties were stationed on the date when the treaty entered into force, or the Mediterranean Sea or the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. So again, like vessels and so on of member states that are above this line are covered not when they are outside of this line. Below this line, they're actually not covered anymore by the treaty. And the reason why the document speaks of occupation forces is because, of course, at the time in 49 when this was signed, the US, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, they had occupation forces in many parts of Eastern Europe where they occupied, for instance, Germany, right? And the former, like the defeated Nazi territories and you know the then liberated parts of Europe, or liberated as they are then called today. But these occupation forces are not meant to be, of course, in breach of NATO. They are meant to be covered by the NATO treaty. So that's it. This is the area, you know, and this is quite important to understand that the Article 6 still until this date is in force. So I'm showing you this here directly from the NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization homepage. This is on their own homepage. This is what they are saying. This is our most foundational document. This is our charter. This is our constitution. This is the law of the land of NATO. And let's just also go over Article 7 for 1 second. This treaty does not affect and shall not be interpreted as affecting in any way the rights and or obligations under the Charter of the parties which are member to the United Nations, or the primary responsibility of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security. So again, the Charter makes sure to establish that it itself is subordinate to the UN, right? And cannot replace any kind of UN actions, and certainly not be taken in contravention to the UN. So this is very significant, and the reason why I point this out, also why I point out that this is on the NATO's own homepage, is that today's NATO is a completely different animal. Today's NATO proudly states that it operates in areas outside of these confines, right? Operations and missions, past and present, on the same homepage. The organization talks about what it is today, and I find this fascinating, you know, where it now introduces itself as NATO is a crisis prevention and management organization. NATO is not anymore a collective self-defense organization. It's a prevention and management organization, and it's not only preventing and managing crises on its territory and on the places where the charter defines that it is supposed to work on. It engages in operations and missions around the world. It actually says so on their own homepage. So on one side, you have this article, like in their foundational charter, which clearly outlines where it operates, right? In which areas are covered by the treaty. And then on the next page, you've got today's understanding of NATO of itself, where it says we operate around the world, and we manage and prevent crises, of course. Which is another thing. I'll talk about this later, but this is really fascinating to me. Also, that then the very next bullet point on this page says that since 1999, NATO has led a UN mandated operation in Kosovo. This is actually really important because 1999 was the first time NATO seriously, honestly, and without any kind of pretense overstepped its treaty mandate when it said that now we are going operational on the so-called out of area in an out of area mission. And ever since 1999, out of area has become a common talking point for NATO to just justify them being involved anywhere and everywhere where they deem that they can and should be involved, all while, and I just need to say this, not changing the charter. This is quite important because, of course, in the charter, the next articles, 8 to 14, they're procedural articles, they established the Atlantic Council and stuff like that. They also established that this charter can be changed. Of course, it can be changed, but it can only be changed unanimously. And in order to do so, you would actually need to discuss this, right? You need to come to an agreement, and then you need to make public that you are changing the charter, and that thereby you're changing the nature of how the organization presents itself. But that's not what they do. NATO just breaches its own charter. It just goes anywhere it wants. It started bombing Serbia. It bombed in 1999 Belgrade, not just Belgrade, all of Serbia actually, and then clipped away Kosovo from the rest of Serbia. And I'll talk about this in just a second. But this is 1999 is a very pivotal moment for the development of NATO as a war-making organization. In 2018, NATO initiated a non-combat advisory and capacity building mission in Iraq, which aims to help strengthen Iraqi security, institutions, and forces so that they themselves can prevent the return of ISIS. I highlighted this just because I wanted to show that NATO justifies its existence by preventing ISIS from coming back into power in Iraq, and in neighboring Syria. All Western countries, all the NATO member states are super happy to support this government of Mr. Al-Jolani, who's an ISIS al-Nusra, which is ISIS, an ISIS offspring. So while in one country the whole point of Western security is to prevent ISIS, then in the other, in the country next door, the very same countries are super happy to support ISIS, which just again shows the hypocrisy of this entire institution and this entire approach. When NATO itself and NATO members talk about any kind of rules-based order, what they mean is just the rules that they pull out of their hats at the very moment when something becomes politically expedient. The you can read through this NATO homepage for quite a while and just wonder how people take or can take this seriously when they constantly try to portray themselves as acting according to certain principles and values. I mean, for a matter of fact, this is just great power politics. As hard as it comes, you just use military power wherever military power is currently useful, and then you criticize anybody else who does something similar as being in breach of the UN. This is really quite something. You can also look at current operations and missions. You know that there's still a mission in Kosovo, even after now like 25 years later. There's still a big NATO mission, and not only a NATO mission. There is a huge NATO camp, a military camp, Camp Bondsteel, on Kosovo premises. And just to reiterate this, Kosovo is this little part here that Serbia still claims is part of its own territory. Kosovo is not internationally recognized. It's not a UN member. It is recognized by a couple of states. Kosovo is recognized here. Let's look at this by this map. These are the green countries are the countries that recognize Kosovo in one way or another, officially, and recognize them as an independent state. But a large part of the world doesn't. Large parts of South America, Brazil doesn't recognize it, Argentina doesn't recognize it, Russia doesn't recognize it, China doesn't recognize it. Interestingly, even some EU member states don't recognize Kosovo as an independent state. Spain doesn't recognize it, nor does Greece, nor does Romania, nor does Slovakia. They all say like, okay, no, Kosovo, you are still part of Serbia, or we don't take a position on this one, but we don't recognize you as an independent state, right? And in international relations, recognition is everything. If everybody recognizes you, then you do exist de facto and de jure for the purpose of also international law. But here, this is with Kosovo, that's simply not the case. And still, NATO, the territory of NATO then, like, of course, extends over all of the NATO member countries. Kosovo is not even one of those member countries, but Kosovo now, since 1999, has this huge air base run by the Americans, but with troops also from other supporting states. That's just a matter of fact that the Serbian government says we don't want that. We want this to be gone. But the government of Kosovo itself, of course, says we want to maintain this base. This is an important one for us. And the NATO is just simply staying there. The Serbs, ever since 1999 have been very bitterly aggrieved by the situation of Kosovo because the Serbian army today can, of course, not go to Kosovo. The KFOR makes sure that that this territory is de facto self-ruled, very much like the situation between Ukraine in the Donbass and also with Crimea. It's a different situation. It is a different situation. You cannot compare them very well because you will always run into quite big differences. But still, the way that the NATO and Western countries clipped off Kosovo from Serbia and just made it a matter of fact is very reminiscent to how Russia made reintegrated Crimea into the Russian Federation as a matter of fact, despite agreements or despite objections by the previous owner, Ukraine. The most important issue with Kosovo is that the Serbs keep saying that under Resolution 1244, to which Serbia's predecessor state, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, to which they acceded, to which they agreed to this 1244, that this one promised them that Kosovo would be that there would be a deployment of troops of international peacekeepers to Kosovo. That was agreed. Okay, fine, and Serbia said this is okay, but also that that the Kosovo Liberation Army would be demilitarized. And where is it? The most important thing for the Serbs today is that there was this promise in this 1244 resolution that Kosovo can enjoy substantial autonomy within the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and which will provide a transitional administration while establishing and overseeing the development of provisional democratic self-governing institutions to ensure conditions for a peaceful and normal life for inhabitants of Kosovo. 1244 makes it very clear that the whole idea was to have Kosovo as part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So today's what's left today of that is Serbia. Serbia is the successor, the official legal successor state of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And it wasn't independence that was promised to them. Actually, the phrase back in the time is more than autonomy, but less than independence. So it's in a sense what we have here is more of a fight as like compared to what Taiwan and China are going through. What is the status of Taiwan? What is the status of Kosovo? But the matter of fact is that today NATO has this huge basis there, and it is of course unthinkable that militarily Serbia could somehow take back Kosovo. And this is not something we would want, right? You wouldn't want any kind of escalation. It's just quite striking that NATO member states don't understand why outside forces do not perceive them as hostile anymore. When you look at the experience of Yugoslavia and later Serbia in connection with NATO, and how NATO just as a matter of fact changed international borders, which they are saying is illegal and cannot be done when other states attempt to do it, like Russia, or when they implement referendums that Western states don't recognize. But when the West implements with force, then referendums and other political changes that others don't recognize, then that is of course fine. Again, it's the hypocrisy of the entire enterprise that is so outrageous. And the dangerous thing is, of course, that we now have an institution, an organization, which officially in Article 6 defines the area of its engagement in very narrow scope, in a very narrow way. And that it's still defined in that way, while then de facto, the organization just goes abroad. It goes to Kosovo. It goes far beyond the maritime limits of the charter. It also goes, where do we have it? Goes into Iraq. Iraq is not part of any NATO country, right? It has cooperation with the African Union, NATO air policing, NATO support and earthquake relief of Turkey. Okay, earthquake relief and capacity in order for civilian support. I have nothing against that. But all of the places also terminated operations and missions, right? Previous missions in Afghanistan. Somebody needs to explain to me when Afghanistan ever became a NATO territory, right? When did the charter define that Afghanistan is covered by it? That never happened. It's also quite funny that this page then just says that in April 2021, the Allies decided to start the withdrawal of RSM forces by 1st of May 2021, and the mission was terminated in early September 2021. Of course, this page doesn't point out that the Taliban just overtook the government of Afghanistan, eradicated the previous government, and took over power again. The mission was terminated. It was just ended. We do not talk about why it was ended. We do not talk about the fact that NATO, after 20 years, has been defeated in Afghanistan, that for 20 years, the occupation of Afghanistan was illegal to begin with and actually wasn't successful, that NATO had to withdraw. But okay, it was terminated. But again, like Afghanistan was never covered by the North Atlantic Treaty. Also, this counter-piracy in the Gulf of Aden and the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is officially outside this zone. So NATO just bit by bit expands the places and scope of where it can go and where it itself says it can go without even bothering to change its foundational documents, right? Again, NATO in Iraq, NATO in Libya, the Libya bombing campaign, and the bombing and the justification of bombing of large parts of the country, when in fact the UN resolution that called on NATO to help only gave it a mandate for a no-fly zone, so make sure that no Gaddafi airplanes fly in the skies, and then NATO actually uses this as an excuse to start bombing the facilities of Libya, of the Libyan state, and in the end caused the complete downfall of Gaddafi. This is this huge problem today with NATO, that this institution is not out of control. I think it is very much under the control of Washington and its allies, but that it is being used over and beyond anything it says about what itself can and cannot do. And I cannot stress enough the importance of this 1999 moment, when the NATO for the first time went out of area and learned its most important lessons. There are documents today that also showed how NATO back then, when it bombed Yugoslavia, how it went about its business. This is a very interesting United Nations report of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Although I am not very happy with how this report is created, at least it gathered a couple of evidence about what was done. One of these points that I just want to show you because it is so infamous is the NATO bombing, the attack on the RTS, Serbian radio and TV station in Belgrade here on April 23rd, 1999, at 2:20 a.m. NATO intentionally bombed the central studios of RTS. It's just one of many civilian facilities. That's this one here, that then completely, utterly burned down. It's a civilian radio station. Of course, where were we? Of course, NATO says that this civilian radio station was also used for military purposes. Therefore, it was a legitimate target of military engagement. And I must say again, there was no UN resolution, there was no Security Council resolution authorizing the use of force. So this is the first time NATO not only went outside of its own borders, it also did so without UN security resolution, right? With Security Council resolution. So this is the moment when NATO really became, not only according to its own charter, illegal, it also became an international criminal. Because again, the only institution that under international law has the power to demand the use of force is the Security Council. No Security Council resolution, no international law justification for the use of force. That's just the rules of the game. The rules of the game that the powers, the victors of the Second World War, created for themselves. And you can go and argue as much as you want about the responsibility to protect and preventing another Srebrenica. That's something that comes up often. So preventing another genocide. guys, if there's no resolution, then you're doing it. And even if what you do is morally right, it is still not under the, it's still not part of the international law setup of the entire game, the way that the game has been defined. So just swallow it, just agree that this was a highly illegal act. And it was not only illegal according to international law, it was illegal according to your own charter, to your own NATO founding document. So, the interesting thing here is, of course, that this report also documents how, for the bombing of this radio station, what that the prime minister at the time, he was an idiot back then, and he's an idiot, and there's still an idiot today, and also the prime minister is still an idiot today. I mean, I don't know why they keep electing idiots for this position, but the Tony Blair at the time actually spilling the beans and saying like why NATO was authorized to attack this radio station. Just read this. British Prime Minister Tony Blair was reported as saying to the Times that the media is the apparatus that keeps Milosevic in power, and we are entirely justified as NATO allies in damaging and taking on those targets. In a statement of April 8, 1999, NATO also indicated that the TV studios would be targeted unless it broadcasts 6 hours per day of Western media reports. If President Milosevic would provide equal time for Western news broadcasts in this program without censorship, 3 hours a day in the noon and at 6 and 3 hours and during the day between 1800 and midnight, then his TV could be an acceptable instrument of public information. NATO actually admitted, and Tony Blair admitted, that one of the reasons for bombing this installation was because it was a propaganda tool, a so-called propaganda tool by the Serbian state, and that in and of itself is not a justification for under international law to target a civilian installation. Actually, civilian installations under international law are protected from being targeted by militaries. And then the oldest trick in the book is, of course, to claim dual use, which the people here did. It's like it's a dual use facility, but it's pretty clear that what NATO was doing there is trying to intimidate and bully the Serbs and break their will. And this was also said later on, not just to make sure that the propaganda apparatus doesn't work anymore. I mean, the public broadcasting apparatus. Just imagine for 1 second if Russia demanded that European radio station, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and DW and CNN and BBC, that they allocate 6 hours a day to distribute Russian viewpoints on their broadcasting systems. Just imagine that for 1 second. But this was one of the demands of NATO in order to not attack a civilian broadcaster, right, in Serbia at the time, and that this was still regarded as normal back then. And still today, you find a lot of people who will find it outrageous that I don't agree with attacking civilian infrastructure when the civilian infrastructure is used for propaganda purposes, right? So in any case, I cannot overstate the importance of 1999 and the way that NATO went beyond, way beyond its official missions. This is, in my view, and I could say much, we could talk much more about this. We could talk about the way then Afghanistan went down and the way Iraq went down and all of the breaches of international law left and right. But I think you get the point. The important thing here to know is that although the NATO Charter itself defines the scope of NATO and the area of operations in a very limited way, today's NATO went far beyond that, and it went so naturally without even changing these documents. And this is the danger. This is the danger of these goddamn warfare institutions that then just empower themselves and become a tool not only to manage the outside, but also to manage the inside and coerce its member states. And now we're going to see, of course, how one NATO member is trying to coerce another one to give up its territory, how the United States wants to take away territory from Denmark, both NATO members, and how these organizations are used as power projection tools, very intentionally, and how then the rhetoric of these institutions always hides behind, the peaceful intention of the charter. Just read the charter; it's so peaceful. And yes, Article 1 and 2 are very peaceful. They're beautiful. It's a very good articles. And then the institution grows to be a monster, which is why which is why we have to be so alert about the monsters we create. And this NATO monster at some point must come to an end and be replaced by something that actually helps peace and security on this planet. Thank you.